Hi, this is Michael Becker, and welcome to this episode of the Identity Nexus, a podcast, videocast that really looks at this idea of how do we create an equilibrium state of the flows of personal information and identity amongst all of the actors within society. Yeah, with me today is Angie Raymond. She is the Director of Data Management and Information Governance at the Ostrom Workshop. So Angie, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. First and foremost, a little bit about you and the Ostrom Workshop. So essentially, who are you and what's the Ostrom Workshop and why should people care?
Of course. So the Ostrom Workshop was founded by Eleanor Ostrom and her husband. And it's the product of a lot of years of research in which she examined how to think about and consider spaces of shared spaces and how we should manage them.
And
So
a shared space is the park.
Sure, it can be everything from a park to a body of water, to a community garden, right? But she also looked at, conversations about should infrastructure be more local or more centralized at the top, right? So some of her famous studies, for example, had to do with, police forces and whether or not that should be one centralized big sort of unit or whether or not local communities should be engaged and the police officers should be in the local communities. So it's very much about thinking about most of her work she was prolific in her work, I should say, but the work that I'm most interested in is how you make those decisions, right? How you think about places where we have a shared interest and what that looks like and who gets to make decisions and how we get all the people in the room to have a voice in those conversations if we should, or if we should be thinking of different structures. And so the workshop was actually founded by her, quite frankly, because she won a Nobel Prize doing this work. And so we were incredibly fortunate for her to create the workshop out of, that research path in which she was engaged.
And I'll let you pitch it. The workshop is housed where?
So we're actually on Indiana University at Bloomington, on the Bloomington campus. And, the really neat part about it is that for those of you who are familiar with universities, that workshop is a really different term in a university context. So this is very much designed to be a meeting space of a lot of different disciplines, from economics to political science to law to policy, and in today's world, we also do tons of work with the computer scientists and the informatics people, to start talking about these very large conversations as it relates to, in this instance, of course, your data.
Yeah, and so on that note, so let's take a step back then. So the Ostrom Workshop is an initiative built around Eleanor Ostrom's Nobel Prize winning work on the community commons. These common resources, environments, services, and it was primarily in her day. It was primarily the physical elements, but now you, in your role, are moving this into the community data commons, if you will, or the data commons community, however we want to review those words, because as we coalesce and collect all this data up, that has tremendous amount of value for society. But at the same time, from the individual contributing that into the pool, what are their rights? What are their obligations? Do they get to be remunerated by their contribution to the community commons? And and again, I believe this affects every aspect of our social lives. And one common case I often refer back to is that of the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks. I'm sure you're familiar with that one, but in the 1950s, her cancer cells were taken by the medical industry and have essentially become the foundation of all modern day cancer research. And it was just until about 10 years ago that it was recognized that she never gave permission for her genetic profile to be stolen and for companies to build trillions of dollars worth of value off of her genetic property and her personal asset. But yet it was. And so it was eventually remunerated. The family was remunerated, all that. But we have so many of those kinds of things happening whether or not be for healthcare or my car driving down the road. Yeah, if you can take all the data from my car, you can certainly make a more efficient transportation system. But it's my car, I fueled it, I drove it, I maintained it, I produced the data. To what extent is that data mine, or is it the community's? And are those the kinds of things that you're digging into? And let's talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's obviously tons of research in the area of, physical locations or physical assets, or, that individuals are governing, right? So, think of your local community garden. Chances are good you have some rules about how, the people who are contributing to the community garden have to behave, who gets access, what times can you have access, how you have to behave as it relates to other people. Maybe you have a requirement that you don't use certain pesticides, and all that stuff is really all those rules and the barriers to entry and the expectations once you're there, and how you behave with your piece of the property compared to others. All of that are the ideas that we're trying to think through, but we're thinking this through in the conversation about data. So, there is a real push. Medical data is one of the common ones that we end up talking about, because there is this real tension between the idea of, I'm not a big fan of thinking about who owns the data, but it's a okay place to start, of course.
Well, and ownership or control. All right. Ownership often begets like some type of property right, and you can have a whole bunch of legal discussions. But at the end of the day, who gets to control the data?
Right.
And in that process of control, who gets to get value from it?
Yes.
And let's talk about it in that context.
Right. And so I prefer the word control. I think that's one that resonates in a more global community, right? Because not everyone attaches property rights necessarily to data, and it's a bit of a controversy as to that. So, to take out some of that legal conversation that sometimes has to, start the conversation depending on where you're standing, having the conversation, and just to talk about who has, who should have the ability to make decisions as it relates to data point A, whatever it is, from, the x-rays or the scans, or even just the information that I enter into in terms of medical history, that I enter into what is now oftentimes a medical database held by our health providers. And so, different entities have control of that data. And from having control, certain responsibilities arise. And of course, Americans will be aware of, if we're talking about medical data, HIPAA sometimes implying and things like that. But the real conversation that I want to talk about is, okay, let's actually talk about things like, medical health information that maybe I share, and how that information or those particular data points could be shared in a way that respects my ability to still make decisions with that information and data, but does allow me quite potentially to share into a larger environment and allow maybe medical researchers to discover things that we could have never discovered without the sharing of this data. So that's sort of.
Let me pause you right there. So for example, one example of that is if we all start feeding our illness data up into a data pool, aka large language model, to which an AI engine then could iterate against, we may be able to come up with solutions. And not even maybe, it's been proven. When you have a bunch of medical information collected into a pool that an AI can interrogate, it can come up faster with results and new medications and new suggestions than a group of humans can. And that's the power of a data pool. But the question is, how do you govern that? Going back to some of your earlier comments.
Right. So there's several questions that arise from that. But the conversation that we're really having today is okay. But let's say I do put my data or my medical health history into some type of format, as you're speaking of. There's all kinds of additional questions to that, right? Are there certain places that I would not want it shared? And so the original conversation is, how do we even create this environment where I can choose to join and share this data? But then the next conversation is, okay, and then what level of detail do I get in terms of control? And some of you, I mean, in theory, you could start talking about Some of you will self-manage or have an external manager of your retirement account, for example. And you may or may not be familiar with the fact that you can change sort of the settings. Do I want 60% bonds? Do I want 40%? Right? And so those are what decisions should the individuals get to make along the way? And oftentimes from the original structure that you set up, that's where you set up those decisions. So if you are familiar with retirement accounts and stuff, you recognize you join different sort of tranches or different groups. Let's just do groups and in this particular situation, I want a lot of control, or maybe I want to join a group of individuals who are only going to do investments as it relates to businesses that are claiming to be green and sustainable. And I don't want money going to these other entities, right? And so a very similar idea, if you're familiar with those type of concepts. These aren't necessarily ideas that we don't see other places. The question is, what can we learn from all those other places, and how much do we import into this environment? And how do we even start those conversations? Because people really are in a place where I'm not convinced they really understand how many different places their data sits at any one time. And so this conversation is actually proving to be much more difficult than I think some of us anticipated, quite honestly.
And let's pause there. I mean, is it that people don't understand where their data actually sits, or is it that they don't fully understand how and where their data is produced, or just not fully understand
all the above.
how it goes from production to a place to being sitting, and all of the actors in the middle that are taking advantage of it or benefiting from it? Or do they not understand both the opportunity that could be had from that data, as well as the harms that might occur if it's not properly stewarded?
I fully believe all the above. So one of the things that is easy for us to forget is the scale and the breadth of technology entering into our lives. And so I don't consider myself young, but I also don't consider myself old. Nonetheless, I didn't grow up with a cell phone. Right. So you're asking a generation of very active in even the employment work environment of people who were used to landlines to suddenly have to understand and cope with massive changes in technology. And the reality is that particular, like my generation, is oftentimes identified as the generation who's first starting to make enough money to actually have, life. But yet we're in the position where we're being asked to understand levels of technology that most of us didn't grow up with. And then it happened so quickly that even if we were to push out, education on the news, it's really very difficult, in my opinion, for people to fully be aware of what you're talking about. And you and I before, not to give a plug to anyone else, but you and I before we went live, we're talking about John Oliver. I mean, he's a perfect example of someone who pushes out stuff on this all the time, as it relates to all the different places that your data sits and how it's used. And, that's absolutely, we should be applauding him for doing that, but it's just demonstrative of the fact that, we have so much more to do so people truly understand the scope of your data.
And I'll put it in the comments, but he's got one on data brokers that is just hysterical. And for those that aren't aware of, data brokers are these third-party companies that amass and collect our data from public records or private commercial partnerships, etc. And they're just amassing thousands and thousands of data points and interpretations on everyone, and then turning around and selling and monetizing that data. And that creates some certain amount of value for society, but it also poses a tremendous amount of risk on society. And I think it's that pull or tension that we're really needing to struggle with. And going back to your point of just kind of illustrating, the massive amounts of data that we create as we adopt smartphones, and we adopt that Ring doorbell on our house, or if we're driving it all today in any kind of modern car, it's a connected car, meaning it's chips and it's data, it's got data flowing through it. And there was a stat I saw the other day that suggested that by 2025, we're going to be interacting with an IoT device, an Internet of Thing device, roughly every 13 to 18 seconds of every day, which means that in both public and private environments, we will be leeching our identity and our behaviors and the elements associated with the personal data associated with that identity and the behaviors and the context that generates every 13 seconds to every 13 to 18 seconds every day, both in public and private and commercial environments. And then the
Yeah, my
question
guess
is,
would be
who owns
every
all that data?
right. My guess is that
Or
would be every
controls it?
seconds you're engaging with an IoT device that's controlled by somebody different than the last entity that you engaged with, right? I mean, so the
Well, no,
scale of
but like, for example, when I walk into the grocery store, you know, GE has a whole new set of infrastructure for the lights in the grocery store. Will have Bluetooth sensors built into the lights so that they can tell that that cell phone standing in aisle 5 and has been there for 2.5 minutes.
right.
That's
Yeah.
an example of you leaching data to an IoT device that you didn't even know existed.
Oh, right. But I would suggest to you as well that not only is but if I'm walking around that environment, you could say every second I'm engaged with it. I'm suggesting to you every 13 seconds, you're entering into a new.
Yes. Yeah. Every 13 seconds, you're entering into a new relationship. Right. Yeah. But to your point, you're continuously every second because, well, if you're carrying around your phone, it's a perpetual.
Yeah. And there's, I am officially that person who has the moments where it's like, I'm just not going to carry my cell phone. Yeah, it's almost impossible. And it is truly impossible for me, right? So my phone serves as my point of access, the security that logs me into my work environment. So not having my cell phone with me is not something that I could choose to do. So, this is real. I mean, if we want to go down that path, this is really what I'm worried about is it's become so ubiquitous, but also so expected that you don't even really have a choice to not be sharing your data.
Right. And so then let's go down to that. So you and I, and partly the way you and I met was I was reaching out to you for my personal efforts and, both professional and academic interests in this area of personal data and identity. And, when we talk about this commons, let's go back to the community commons part. And that's what drove our conversation and the community data commons. There's been so much talk about our online selves. There's been so much talk about our digital selves. I think we also need to be adding to the conversation, the whole idea of metaverse, that one day we'll be in this immersive digital environment, like the movie Ready Player One. I was thinking about a new term last week, and in fact, it's not the metaverse that's really important. It's what I'm now starting to call the Fijiverse, the phygital environment, right? It's the Fijiverse that matters. It's when my physical self is out in the physical world, and I need to now present, say, an age verification. Well, I'm going to do that using my digital identities and my digital credentials, and that's the Fijiverse, and how do we handle that? And so when we talk about this data commons and this point of management, I proposed, and maybe if you don't mind, we can talk about it a little bit, this concept of the identity nexus, this idea that individuals, public, private institutions we'll call them enterprises, and government institutions, we'll call that the public organizations. So individuals, private and public organizations are all kind of overlapping on some Venn diagram. The community commons circles around that. And we need to find an equilibrium state of the flows of personal data and identity as it's balanced at a macro level amongst those primary three actors. Otherwise, we're going to end up in this horrific dystopia where Orwell was an optimist, or we can strive for a utopia, but then we'll likewise have chaos there because to your point, we do need the data going into the commons. We do need the data going to the government. We do need the data going to our commercial relationships so that society can actually function.
Right. So, that's right.
And so there has to be this flow, but in balance of the value to each of the individual actors, individuals, enterprises, and public institutions, against the risks that they may experience, the ratio of the risk that they may experience from that flows, plus any net value of the externalities, both the positive and then the negative things that may happen from the communal collection of those things. And for me, it's like, we've got to figure out how to solve that formula, right? That's kind of like the next stage to the Ostrom work is the Nobel Prize winning work is to solve the identity nexus equation.
Yeah, exactly. So to have those conversations about, how we can stick with balance. Balance to a lawyer is sort of a difficult word to talk about because we use it in so many different contexts. So one of the things that I'm increasingly concerned about is we're not even asking the questions, right? And so the conversation about how you create balance only comes from an informed group of individuals telling you what they're concerned about and being engaged in the conversation at some level. And so that is also a balance, right? Because we've known for, a very long time that people can't vote on everything. It's why we do representatives and things like that, right? You'll just be overwhelmed by it. So you've not only got to find a way to get people to understand so they can engage in these conversations, so they can express to you that, hey, look, I'm not okay with this type of data sharing, or this goes too far, or, having an external source of identity management maybe isn't okay for people. Those conversations we have to start having, right? And then we can, and I agree with you. The next conversation is really, in these digital worlds, how are we going to manage that? Because it's going to very much depend on us sharing oftentimes a lot more than we are sharing, today. If I walk into my place of employment right now, in theory, you could imagine me scanning my badge to go in, for example, or maybe using a key, even going back, historically. But there are only like 10 people who know that, right? And I might bump into 15 people in the hallway. One of the problems with the online world is millions of people might know this. And that's the other thing that we oftentimes forget is, we have never really grappled with the scale of what it is that we're talking about. Right. And so the common argument in a lot of these instances when you're talking about it, well, I need to know who you are, so I know you're in the right place type of conversation, really oftentimes, arises in the context in the conversation where we're almost analogizing keys and badges to entry. And we've been doing this forever. Yeah, like 10 people at my workplace know I've logged in somewhere. And maybe I bump into another, let's just pretend 100 people, which is way too many. It's still not people in Italy, right?
Well, and the reality is they're going to forget. Whereas the digital fingerprint never forgets. Right. So it never forgets, and it's not forgetting at scale.
And it's not even capable of forgetting.
Right.
I mean,
especially now when you start talking about immutable blockchains, right? And such. And that brings us to kind of this other idea too. And I think when we talk about the community commons, in that up until around 2010, before through APIs via systems, we were really very much based as a causation economy. If then that, we made decisions by if this happened, then we'll do that. But since we've now interjected into the world of AI and the world of data and the world of algorithms, we're now really in a correlation-based society. It's not if this happened, then do that. It's if the probability of this happening is then we do that. And so in other words, now we're also starting to make our decision making and influencing is all being increasingly based on probabilities, which we've been around for 10,000 years. This has been happening for 10. So we're not prepared for this.
Well, I think we're not prepared for the expansion of that, right? We've always had some types of science and some types of
but not at this scale.
Right, not at this
scale. And that's what I refer to it as. Digital data global warming. It's essentially what's happening is the benefits. Everything's greater at the extreme. Right. So it gets hotter, it gets colder. The benefits are greater, but also the risks are greater, and they happen greater in extremes. And I think that's kind of what we're experiencing.
Yeah. And in addition, the number of times that I can make a decision based on a lot of data that actually increases my confidence in the prediction or, that you're putting forward is also much bigger now as well. But the problem is also that I'm oftentimes thinking that the mass generalization of a lot of this data should actually cause us to reduce our confidence. Right. So for example, I can tell you with some pretty good certainty about how many students are going to graduate, undergrad students are going to graduate on the Bloomington campus each year. Right. We know our percentages. When does that change? Right. But we're pretty comfortable and confident in the numbers that we put out. But sooner or later, that's going to change. And the question is, how will we even recognize it changes before it's already changed and we haven't been able to adjust because we're confident. Right.
Right.
And this is what begins to worry me, right? We're pretty good at predicting with pretty good confidence how many undergrads will actually start and complete in the Bloomington campus. And by the way, it's a very high number. We're pretty proud of it. With that said, I would argue that we also have a pretty predictable admission cycle that includes predictable countries that we draw from. What happens when we introduce completely different cultures into our educational system? What happens when we expand education into environments and places that we hadn't? And this is going to change those ability to predict. But we're always when we use this type of structure, we're always years behind.
Yes.
If you're using today's data to make a prediction, and that confidence is based on last year and 2 years ago, you're not able to react today to changes because you're still confident, but you're not even thinking about the fact that that's actually probably based on historic data, not necessarily a true ability to think through what other changes. And that's really what begins to start worrying me as well, as we get so stuck in sort of using statistics in the way that statistics should be used, but not recognizing some of the things that most statisticians could tell you is a problem. This is really good assuming static state. When don't we have a static state? I don't know, but right now, we're not even talking about that, of what things would have to change in that data environment to cause us to lose confidence. We're just not very good at it yet. And we don't even contemplate it. We just stick with it. And sometimes we're then 2 or 3 years behind, in making the adjustments that are otherwise necessary to be made.
Yeah, and again, the challenge with that statement is I think more is going to change in the next 5 years than has in the last 100.
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah.
Right.
So one of the things I constantly say is, look, if you're not really comfortable with chaos, you're in trouble for the next few years, right? Between the pandemic, the mass growth of technology, the power of computation. I mean, generative AI is something else. Right? If you're not comfortable with mass change fast, you are really going to struggle for the next 5 or 6 years, because it's come, and it's just.
And to your point, data is at the heart of this.
Data is absolutely at the heart of this.
Data is at the civic level, it's at the heart of this. At the commercial level, it's at the heart of this. At the individual level, it's at the heart of this. And to the point that stimulated our conversation today, at the community commons level,
that's right,
part of this. And basically, the takeaway I'm getting from this conversation is, in many ways, we have significantly more questions that we need to be answering or asking before we can even start answering them.
Absolutely. One of the hardest things to do when we're talking about governing a data commons, for example, a shared environment where people are creating rules and stuff, is to get them to understand that there is no playbook, and it's going to take you some time. And explaining to people right now that you are actually, in many ways, creating a community that has to have some type of trust. And that can be personal trust. It can be technology-driven trust. I mean, there's a lot of other, right? There's a lot of ways we can do this, but it doesn't happen overnight. You just don't plug and play this and make it happen and everyone's happy and it's going to work. When people realize you got to roll up your sleeves and spend some time on it, it's very difficult for people to not only commit the time up front, but to understand that to sustain this, you have to continue to commit the time. And it's one of the things we're struggling with right now in a lot of the communities that we work with is, the 6 of you who are super energized to do this, this is going to take a little bit of time. You're not just going to plug and play this for tomorrow. But additionally, now you've created this data commons. It's got data in it. It's got stuff in it. And so it needs to, in theory, have some longevity to it.
To be maintained and the stakeholders involved need to be properly stewarded and secured.
Right.
And then that raises the huge question. I mean, at the end of the day, who's going to pay for all of this?
Well, this is my, I'm at a business school. So this is usually where the rubber sort of hits the road, right? We've had plenty of great ideas, quite honestly, that are very much based on, 5 or 6 people really investing their time as the cost, right? Or think of
but that's they're investing the time as the cost, but at some point there has to be profit, right? Going back to the business example, like how do those people get remunerated in the end or supported in the end? Like, or what is society going to look like as we're figuring all this out?
Yeah, I think we have lots of free labor in tech that we rely on. We've got Wiki and, all of these different shared environments where we're all just committed to doing good and everyone rolls up their sleeves and works like hell. And there's a massive cost to that really is not necessarily functioning as that traditional business model. And if we, in my personal opinion, if we continue to rely on free labor and volunteers to create, digital infrastructure, we're going to be surprised how many people get tired of that fast. And what you're saying is right? It doesn't put food on the table. It doesn't allow me to do rent. So this is all true volunteerism in a lot of these environments, because I still have to do my day job, or I still have to figure out how I'm going to pay the rent. And our increasing reliance on digital infrastructures that are truly built on the backs of volunteers, including volunteers that host their own servers. Right? This is your anti-Twitter movement.
Right. And so then there's hard costs there, right? Because now I've actually got electricity and hardware and
and people depending on me. So I feel obligated. It's a volunteer, but there's tons of instances where people are like, I had no idea it was going to be this hard, this much time. I had to get a new server. I had to double up because all these people subscribed, and that's awesome. And oh my gosh, I don't have capacity to manage this. What am I going to do? Right. And this is sort of where our digital environment and a lot of these digital commons environments as well, rely right now on these aspirational volunteers who are hoping to change the world. But they get tired, and they should get tired, and they're entitled to be tired. And we need to figure out how to actually make this an infrastructure, not just volunteers doing what might be the right thing.
Okay. So let's kind of wrap it up then. So in a few words, how can you summarize for me, where are we at with this emerging idea of a data commons? Why should people care? And what do they do next?
Well, so why should people care is a pretty easy one. We have the opportunity for the data that we're in control of, have control over the data and share it in places that we find valuable, regardless of how you define value, right? So if I think value is, adding and contributing to a community of medical researchers, and here's my data, we're currently in the world where this can happen and is happening some places, right? So you need to care because the data has value, and we're about ready to maybe go down the other extreme where we begin to place restrictions and limitations on data sharing in ways that will just be presumptively, the answer is no as it relates to these things. So, you should care because some of your data, a lot of your data has real value in the right hands, being used the right way, protected with the right structure, and therefore you should care.
And by the way, and on that point, if it's in your control, like I'm a relatively smart, educated person, but I'm not going to manage my finances. I got my financial advisor for that.
That's right.
So there's, so I call him up and I'm like, dude, figure it out. Right. And so that's part of the why you should care model too, is who's going to be your advocate? Who will you delegate to?
That's right. That's where I was going, is if you don't care, someone else is going to care for you. And we have lots of good, other examples where they don't get it right. Right. So,
or they're going to care, but not necessarily in your interests.
Right.
So on that note, so what do they do next? What happens next?
Well, so there's plenty of opportunities to get involved. And, that's the big thing, right? When people start asking you about these type of things, you need to get involved. You need to be, but the biggest thing is you need to let us, a lot of us, begin to have these conversations and get the infrastructure set up in a way that actually does something right. If you're a tech person or in this space yourselves, you need to get involved in these conversations. Not enough people are having these conversations. And before we can roll this out to get broader, participation and broader feedback, we have to be able to have sort of, here's what we're talking about, and, all the stuff that we had to do at various times when we're trying to educate the public. But first, we need a group of people who already know about this stuff to be in the room having the important conversations before we set up something or we go down a path that is not going to work well for many, many people.
And you're there to help. So people can reach out to you,
Absolutely.
start having those conversations, and let's build a community around the workshop. As you said,
Absolutely.
people can come and have these workshop-y conversations. So people can come to you, they can engage you, be part of the workshops at the Ostrom Institute, and actively get involved with you. Is that not the case?
Absolutely. So we do tons of stuff, and we do all hybrid stuff. So you don't need to be in Bloomington, Indiana. We try to do it at times that are, accommodating to the global community. And we do nothing but have conversations about this, do research on this, engage with individuals who are, trying to set up their own commons, or how might we manage this. And it's a passion of what we do. And we certainly, we do engage in these conversations in a global community. There's tons of people working on this, and we are bringing them together. That's true.
Well, Angie, well, thank you very much. This was absolutely fantastic. And we'll definitely want to have you again. And we'll catch up with you later, okay?
Thank you very much. It was lovely to be here.
Perfect. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.